with Syntax, and today we're going to go over iframes. What are they and how we interact with them? As I do always mention, please watch previous videos. We do build upon the next, and it make what we're currently watching, what we're currently learning, a little bit more easy to understand. Alright guys, so iframes, what are they? Well, we're here in our syntax practice site, as we gave you guys that resource in the last videos. Now, iframes. If we see here, when I'm scrolling through the page, I'm interacting with the page. But do you see here this border? And this border here? Believe it or not, this is its own separate frame, right? Its own separate materials, its own separate content, as I can scroll and manipulate this independently without moving the page, right? So when we want to interact with frames and iframes, we need to be able to switch to them, right? We need to be able to tell our window, our driver and browser, that we don't want to have focus on the main page anymore. We want to come inside to this own little world here. So if we try to send kind of any code and interact with anything within a frame without first switching focus from the page we were landing on inside the frame itself, it won't work, okay? So, which is why we have a method called switch to. And we can switch to a bunch of different things, but in this video we're going to switch to the frames itself. Now, what do we need to do? Well, I'll show you here just in a second. Now, I've written some code here, and it looks like a lot, but I'm going to explain it all step by step, and then feel free to stop, pause the video, take notes, and maybe even rewind if I maybe moved a little bit too quickly. Now, a couple things in here is a little bit more, not necessarily advanced, but we haven't gone over, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, mainly here with this JavaScript Executor, but I'll explain that shortly. So, let's get started. We see here that we have our system.set property, our WebDriver, right, driver, we have our Chrome driver, we have our URL here to the frames, and driver.get to the frame page, right? This should not be new. Alright guys, so what I have here is we have our switch to command. And I'm going to show you how to write that. But first I want to go over, we have 3 different ways into switching from our main page to the iframe itself. And this method, switch to .frame, will take 3 different kinds of arguments, right? It's basically pretty much polymorphism, guys, is really what it is. It is a overloaded method. It's a method, a few different of them, that have 3 in particular, that have the same name, but they are different because they have different arguments here, right, that we are allowed to pass, or different parameters. So we can now switch to a frame by its index, by its ID or name, or storing it as a web element and switching to it that way. So let's show you what I mean by index, ID, and name, or web element. Now if we come here into an inspect, right, if it's maybe a Safari or IE, it might say inspect elements or elements. Here in Google Chrome it says inspect. Again, if you guys have any doubt, please go ahead and hit that function 12 key, and if you landed anywhere else here, make sure you select the Elements tab. Alright? Now, what do we mean by index? Well, first things first, what we should do is make sure that this is an actual iframe itself. I know it is because here is our practice page, but you always want to check just to make sure. So what we can do is we can kind of hover over the entire content here and select, and we should be able to see it say frame. So let me go ahead and hover over here and select. Let's open this up, come down, and here we see a tag named iframe. So anytime we're working with an iframe, it'll have a tag of iframe. Makes it pretty easy, right? Now this one happens to be iframe, and this is its name of 2. Alright, so as I mentioned, we can switch by ID or name. So this is a perfect example. If I wanted to switch my focus from the page itself into this iframe, it has the name, right? And the name happens to be frame 2. If this one happened to also have a ID attribute with a value there, we could use that. But in this instance, we see it has frame 2 in name, and that'll work okay, right? That was our second option. Now, our first option, index. We see we have frame 2 and we have frame 1 here. Now, just like in Java with our arrays, indexes start at 0. So if we have two frames here, this is frame by index 0, and this is frame by index 1, right? So we always start at 0 when we're using index in most cases. Sometimes there's different exceptions here, but this isn't one of them. Okay. And what's lastly? We have our web element we can store it by. So if I take this web element, this iframe here, and store it as a web element, whether I find by my name or I create a CSS selector or an XPath and store it as a web element, I can then pass that web element into here as my argument. And that is how we switch between index, ID or name, or web element. And I'm going to show you how to write this out here. So if I wanted to switch to my frame by index, I'm going to do as I did here, right? I'm going to write driver dot switch to, and we can come down here, we can even see it sees switch to here. Then we're going to hit dot, and then we see here that we have these frames. And as I mentioned, you'll see frame as int, which it allows as an argument, as string, and as web element. And what that means here is that it takes a index, right? So an integer, a number. It'll take the name or ID, right? Which is our values, which we saw that was frame 2, I believe. And then we can also store it as a web element, and it'll take that as a argument as well. But if I want to do by index, I just simply chose by frame by int, right? I select, I can put my int, let's say if I wanted to go to the second one, right? Because it would be frame number 1, and this is now frame number 2. Okay? Now, you guys get the idea. If I wanted to go ahead and switch by the name or ID, we saw it here. We have to pass as a string. We saw it as frame 2, right? And then we would end the statement here. Also, if I had stored it as a web element, I could pop it in there as well. All right, so that's how we go ahead and switch to the frames. And as I mentioned, this page itself is one thing, but these frames are its own little world, and we can't have any kind of contact with it until we take the focus away from the page and then come inside the iframe and go ahead and send our commands in this way. Now, my code here. I've coded a little example just to kind of show you what we can do. And there's one more switch to when we're dealing with frames that I wanted to go over. So what I've done is I've stored a button as a web element, and it's this button here. So if I scroll down, I've stored this button in which I can click as a web element, okay? That's what I've done here. Now you see this JavaScript Executor. I told you I didn't want to go into too much detail. For our students, we will be going over this, and there's many different things we could do with JavaScript Executor. It is a great tool to have. But in this instance, if you guys had paused the screen, you could write this down, and what this is doing is I am using my JavaScript Executor, and I'm using a command called execute script. And what I'm passing here, basically what this is allowing me to do is to, once I come to the page here, I'm going to refresh. I'm going to come into here, I'm going to navigate into the iframe, and then what it's going to do is it's going to scroll, right? So I navigate in here by switching to the frame, and then this JavaScript executor is going to scroll down until this web element is in view. So I don't have to put any pixels or anything. It's just going to scroll by itself until this button is in view. And that's a little bit kind of complicated, just a little bit, and we didn't go over it with you guys, but our students, stay tuned, we'll be going over this. Now, once I go ahead and scroll that into view, I'm going to click that button. Okay, so I'm going to click that button, and then what I'm going to do is switch to the default content. Now, what driver dot switch to default content, and we can write this as driver dot again switch to. We see that here, dot and then default content, and then go ahead and put a semicolon here to end our statement. Just that simple, all right? Now, what this does is it takes our focus away from inside the iframe and back to the default content, back to where our focus was before, which happened to be the main page here. Okay, so it's going to lose its focus from inside the iframe, come outside the iframe, and give us back our focus here with the main page. And then lastly, what I did was I went ahead and just to show you that I am able to interact with this page, I went ahead and stored this here as a web element, and I'm clicking it, which is our little image and home link here. If I select this button, it'll bring me back to our home page in our application. I also threw in a couple of sleeps, right, thread sleeps, just so we can kind of see things paused out, stop the code just for a second, so we can see things happening a little bit easier for us to digest. All right. So guys, that's iframes, what they are, and how we interact with them. And I'm showing you here a little quick code example, and we're going to go ahead and run, okay? Let's run. Here we go. We should be scrolling down. There we are. We do see it came over here. It should click, which it did. Bring focus over here, and then click our home icon here, this home button, this home image. And we can see here we're back on the home page of our application. Well guys, that's it for me. This was a very quick and short lesson with iframes, the 3 different ways we can switch between them, and also how to go back to the default content, and also why we need to switch into the iframes here. Alright everyone, well that's it for me. Please feel free to rewind, take things a little bit slower if you need to, and make sure you guys practice, okay? Well, happy coding. See you on the next one.